Monica Bryant, and I am here to talk to you today about some emergency preparedness stuff as you prepare for your environmental health career. And we're going to talk a little bit about personal preparedness and, then what you can expect during an emergency. So when you all took this job, I expect that you took it thinking that you would do one of these standard roles, whether you were hired to do food and lodging or, on-site wastewater with well program, children's environmental health with lead detection, or sometimes there are other kind of standard things that environmental health specialists do. But during an emergency, our standard jobs continue, and we also kind of pick up additional roles. So if there is a disaster, and, we're talking about things like hurricanes or ice storms, large fires, other things that significantly disrupt where the residents of your county would be able to eat and sleep and work and that kind of stuff. So if there is an emergency or a disaster, you are going to probably play a lot of different roles than what you originally signed up for. So not only do environmental health specialists provide food safety, water and wastewater services for their communities, but they also are responsible for things like sanitation and shelters, responsible for the safety of the first responders in their meals and solid waste and vector control and other roles. So while this won't be your everyday work, you need to be prepared to do some of this work as you go throughout your career in environmental health. So before we get into kind of your job responsibilities during an emergency, just want to say a few things about personal preparedness. There are going to be times where you are called on to do work in very stressful, intense situations. So you may personally be living in a location where there could be a storm or a fire or, whatever it is, flooding. And before you can properly do your job, you need to have your own household and family kind of taken care of. So it's important to think about some of these things, ahead of a disaster. We know that average North Carolinians are probably not preparing super early until they may hear a weather forecast or something, but we want you to think way ahead on this so that when the time comes, you're not also worried about what's happening in your own household and you can, get your work done as you need to. So things like power banks have become a lot more affordable and more readily available in recent times. They used to be kind of expensive, but there are all kinds of fun power banks that you can get for your computers, for your cell phones, so that you're able to communicate even if your power is out. And on this slide, you'll just see a couple of pictures of different kinds of power banks. The one on the right is actually solar powered, so you don't even have to plug it in to recharge it. It charges from those solar panels, and then it will charge your cell phone. The other one is a larger power bank, so it would power things like your computer and even sometimes small refrigerators and things. So it's worthwhile to look into this for your household, not just because you need it for work purposes, but also they're good things to have. I know that people talk a lot about having a disaster kit ready, and in that they talk about having different foods, and often they talk about having canned goods. And I don't know about you, but my family's not going to sit down and munch on, a can of beans or something that's cold if we don't have access to power. So think about other things that your family and you may enjoy eating if you don't have power. I know for my family, I keep things like Pop-Tarts because they're big Pop-Tart eaters, protein bars, beef jerky. There are several kind of shelf-stable foods that will provide a protein source that will be more pleasant to eat than, you know, unheated canned chicken or beans. But if that's your thing, then go ahead and put those in your kit. Just make sure you always have a can opener nearby. It's important to make sure that you have the medications that you need for your family and for yourself. Often in advance of an emergency, you can get those ahead of time if you're going to be close to running out. So, check and make sure you've got a week or so worth of medication so you're not worried about that. And another thing that you probably didn't realize that you signed up to do, but now that you work for the health department, you are going to be the person that everyone calls whenever they have any kind of question about this kind of stuff. So I know I get regular calls from just, people I've met from my kids' soccer teams or old high school friends. Other community people who know what I do asking me questions when their refrigerators go out or, when they lose power or if a storm's coming. And it's important to answer those questions and give people accurate information. We know that there's a lot of inaccurate information out there. And, from a food perspective, often people start throwing away lots of things that they don't need to in their personal home refrigerators, things like, ranch dressing or pickles. And so, talking through that with people is important because, it will reduce their own personal food waste. And so it's just important to be prepared personally and to know what to expect and to expect that you'll get lots of questions individually kind of outside of your regular work questions that you'll get. I just want to say a few brief things about the preparedness and response branch. They operate out of the communicable disease branch here at the state. And just like we have regions and regionals for all of our different programs, they do as well. You can see there are 4 regions here, and they kind of provide similar support to preparedness coordinators that your regionals provide, for the different programs. So they, work with your preparedness coordinators on their large-scale exercises, on writing their preparedness plans, on just coordination for statewide events. And so they're a really good resource. We work closely with them, and, as you're working back in your county with your preparedness coordinators, they can be a resource for you as well. You can reach out to me and I can get you linked up with somebody from there who works in your region or someone who works at the state office. So just know that they're there and they're a good resource when it comes to emergencies. You may or may not be aware of the preparedness manual that we published back in 2017, and the information in it is still really up to date. There's a lot of good resources in there for you. Back in 2017, your health department received a printed copy of this manual, but we know that's been a while, so it's on our website, and you can access it there to get the information that you need. And then in terms of some of the handouts in the back, you can always reach out to me because I have those, in single page form if you need them to distribute. So we're going to talk briefly about what you would do from a food safety perspective after a storm hits. Again, we're talking about things like hurricanes or large-scale flooding, ice storms, but you may have, smaller events like a tornado event or a isolated storm incident that could cause a lot of damage. So, an emergency could just be within your county. It doesn't have to be a statewide emergency. And, looking at facilities after the storm, a lot of what you're going to be doing is related to food temperature. So, if there's no power, then the walk-in cooler or refrigerators and freezers have been out of temperature for a period of time. And so you're going to be doing a lot of triage with food to see what can be saved, how long it's been out, and discarding food that has been out of temperature. So sometimes with freezers, if the power comes back on, it can be difficult because, frozen food could get back down to temperature pretty quickly, but it may have been out of temperature for some time. So you want to check for any signs of defrosting and refreezing on cardboard boxes. That's often, a very wet cardboard box, or a lot of ice buildup on the packaging or the boxes. So you'll want to check that, and then, use whatever your county has available in terms of deciding, what food to discard. And certainly your regional specialists will be available to help you as well if you have questions about, something that's been out of temperature for a certain period of time and what temperature it is and whether they need to discard that or not. Our regional specialists are here for that. Your facilities need to have plenty of hot and cold water to clean before they're able to reopen, and also they need that water for hand washing. We're going to talk a little bit about water emergencies specifically here in a few slides. So boil water advisories aside, making sure there's hot and cold water coming out of the faucet is important. Any food contact surface or utensil that was in contact with floodwaters would need to be cleaned and sanitized before it's used again. And then, any food or single service that came in direct contact with floodwaters would need to be discarded. Sometimes there are some dry good containers, specifically aluminum cans, that may survive, contact with floodwater, but that's another one where, your county supervisor and your regional specialist can work with you to decide, if that product has been compromised. Any ice machines or beverage dispensers that hook directly to water would need to be cleaned and sanitized according to manufacturer's instructions. And, often that means the filters need to be changed. And, all of that would be necessary if there was floodwater involved, or, if there was potential contamination to that water, which we'll talk about here shortly. So those are just some things that you would need to do if you were looking at a food facility after a storm. Here are just a couple of pictures. I didn't take these. And they're not specifically North Carolina, but the picture on the left is a building, a restaurant where They've obviously had some storm damage, and that wall in the middle is coming down, and that may just be a dummy wall or a divide between large parcel spaces, so that wall may not hold any weight. But if you see a facility like the one on the left, I would certainly recommend that you contact your local building inspections department before you enter. You want to make sure that you're not walking into a situation that's unsafe. And your personal safety is going to be number one importance. If you're doing an ICS structure, and the goals of that are almost always begin with, the responder safety being number one. So we don't want you to enter into a situation that could be unsafe. The middle picture is just a temporary hand wash setup, which you have seen or will see, hundreds of times, but just know that people will try to do whatever they can, especially if they're just in the cleaning phase before they reopen, because, livelihoods and stuff depend on these facilities being able to reopen. And in talking to folks after storms, they often feel a sense of responsibility to their community to get reopened so they can, feed the people of their community. So it's not always just about making money, but just know that the emotions will be strong in these situations, and they can be very tense. And so you will need to use all of your best tools in your toolbox for communication, knowing that you could be dealing with, very tense situations. So the picture on the right, is just more of a facility that we would expect to enter into after a storm. The floor is, very dirty with sediment from floodwaters, and, they are in the process of beginning to clean, and often you'll work kind of hand in hand with your facilities to get them where they need to be so they can reopen. During a storm, one of the most important things that you can do is to do shelter assessments. These assessments, the copy of the form is there on the right. These assessments are important to make sure that the places where we're sending folks, if their own homes are unsafe, we want those facilities to be, definitely safe and as comfortable as possible, and provide them all of the things that they need to safely, reside there for a period of time, and thinking about all the different types of folks and their needs that may be in a shelter. So making sure there are things like water available for formula or for preparing baby food, places to do diaper changing and stuff like that. These are not mandated inspections, but we really do, kind of urge you to do these because it's important work. Ideally, you would do it before they open, just to make sure that there's, no major deficiencies before people start to come in there. We know that is very often not possible. So, initially doing an inspection, and then, if these shelters remain open for long periods of time, you may do kind of routine inspections. The CDC has a shelter assessment program, and North Carolina has kind of taken their model and applied it here in our state. So thankfully, the last major hurricane that we had was Hurricane Dorian, and that was back in 2019. You can see here the locations where shelters were opened and how many there were in those counties. So, Pitt County and Sampson and Columbus had a large number of shelters that they opened. And at the peak time of operation, there were over 3,000 evacuees living in shelters in North Carolina. And so, again, it's important to, protect those people because we have had, especially in Florence, is the one that comes to mind. We have had norovirus outbreaks in these shelters. So the last thing that we want is for people to have, lost their home, to be, stressed about that, and then to get norovirus and be, explosively vomiting. So it is our goal to keep that from happening. And that's why looking at these shelters and being available to your shelter management and your emergency management is important. So talking specifically about Dorian again, because this is the last one that we had 15 counties in total to complete 31 assessments of shelters. So that was about 41% of what was opened. If we have a storm during any of the upcoming storm seasons, our hope would be that number would be higher. And we communicate those deficiencies back to North Carolina Emergency Management to help you all get the things that you need. The biggest deficiency came from not having diapering areas and food preparation areas for infants and children. Often these shelters are in elementary schools, and their bathrooms, don't usually have a changing station in them, and so it can be difficult to find specific changing areas. And so that's something that you'll want to keep in mind and to speak with your shelter managers about. We also did have some food temperature concerns in those shelters as well. After Hurricane Florence, the state implemented a planned statewide shelter program. So during Hurricane Dorian, the statewide shelter was opened in Durham, and these are real-life pictures that I took while I was out there. This was in the old Sears building at the mall in Durham, and when we got there, there was no air conditioning working because the building, hadn't been in use. It was about 88 degrees inside, and it was, pretty miserable. They did get it cooled off before any folks arrived. So you can see the beds there. We're very much too close together, and we, work to try to get people some space. And then the picture on the right, I had never seen, portable water tanks these large, so I thought it was just interesting for all the restroom trailers and shower trailers that were brought out to serve this location. They needed these large potable water tanks, and then there were wastewater tanks as well. Shelter meals are often going to be served by volunteers, so it's important to make sure, they're not going to have specific food safety training, or, they may not, depending on what job they do, in their regular job. These were actually DHHS employees, but they were not, food safety employees. And so, basically, working with them to make sure there's no bare hand contact, that they're washing their hands, and, how to take some food temperatures, and making sure that they weren't up all night the night before throwing up or taking care of someone who is throwing up, to try to cut down again on that norovirus concern. K&W Cafeteria used to provide a lot of shelter meals. I know they went bankrupt and may be out of business everywhere in the state since our last storm, so it will be interesting to see what kind of meal providers pop up in their absence. The K&W food actually was very good with temperature. You can't really see that thermometer very well, but it was a 161 on that corn, and then we kind of, just implemented a time as a public health control, not an official one, but just, hey, this food is here. We need it to be gone in 4 hours, and we don't need to save the leftovers. And then, because there were there's not a steam table in the middle of the Sears. So, we just have to set up the food and get rid of it, and then make sure we're not saving the leftovers. Cold food is actually much more difficult, and sometimes the breakfast meals won't be hot meals. And they're often shelf-stable things, but I found some yogurts and some turkey sandwiches and some other things that they were trying to keep cold in the 88-degree Sears building on a small amount of ice. So you'll run into that kind of stuff as well. And these temperatures are important. We did set up a quarantine area, and I think, this was all, again, pre-COVID life. I think we thought a lot less about separating sick people back then than we do now. These shelters often didn't have a place for sick people to go. And so we kind of set up this makeshift quarantine area. So if people were vomiting, they had somewhere to go to be separated until they could be permanently moved. And, we tried to move it to an area of the floor that was cleanable, because the rest of the location was carpeted. So again, this may be more of a thought on everyone's minds since COVID has happened, but in 2019 it wasn't, and that was one of the things that we worked with the emergency management folks with the state to provide. So I said we were going to talk about water emergencies. If you are a food and lodging inspector or a child care inspector, these are going to be the emergencies that you deal with the most. I personally, because of my job at the state, get probably 5 to 10 water emergency notifications a day statewide. Often they don't impact any regulated business, but there is always a situation where a water main has broken, or there's planned maintenance or an unplanned interruption of water. And when the pressure drops below 20 psi, water authorities can issue these pressure advisories, and they tell folks to boil the water, and that's just until the results can come back from the bacteriological sampling. So, we see these system pressure advisories, like I said, all over the state every day. A boil water advisory or boil water notice, a true boil water notice comes from a confirmed positive test result, and that's when we know there's contamination to the water, so we do have to require things of regulated businesses with that, and thankfully those come much less frequently. And then occasionally there will be a do not use or do not drink advisory, and that comes when there's some sort of contamination in the water that can't be boiled out. So heavy metals and other chemical contaminants often won't boil off in the water, and then what you're doing is just concentrating those in the boiled water, so boiling it is actually worse. And so there's just no way to safely drink or use that water, and then businesses would have to close as well. There's only been one of these maybe in my 7 years that I've been doing this, and that was in New Hanover County. There was a do not use advisory because there were high levels of fluoride in the water. So it does not happen frequently, but that is the other type of water emergency that there can be. So just to give you the, very brief version of what happens with water emergencies, if there's no water or there's not enough water pressure to wash your hands or run your dish machine or do the jobs that you need to do, a facility can't operate, right? We know that facilities can't operate if they don't have water. During a system pressure advisory, as long as there is adequate water and water pressure, everything that we do for food establishments and other regulated businesses are just recommendations. So think of that as it's a potential contamination issue. So there's no imminent hazard there yet, because we just know that there's higher than baseline chance that those water samples could be positive. But during a boil water advisory, we obviously have a known contamination, and that would be considered an imminent hazard, and permits would be suspended. And the same thing would happen during a do not use advisory. In that emergency manual that we talked about, there are a couple of fact sheets that can help you and your county when you're dealing with these water emergencies. So there's a good fact sheet for system pressure advisory that just provides information for the recommendations that someone may do, during a system pressure advisory. This is really helpful because it can be blasted out via email, to your establishments to try to help with answering some questions, or post it to your website. And counties have been using this for years, and it's a good resource to have. So, basically the first recommendation that we always give is to, not drink the water or use it for drinking or ice, because there's no kill step there for sure. And it would be large quantities of the water. But again, those are just recommendations to use bottled water and bottled beverages. If your soda machines are hooked to the water line, which they usually are, and then to use bagged ice from a approved source. And then there's some information about what to do when your facility is ready to reopen, and it's important to kind of flush the water, especially if it's coming out discolored or has sediment present. So this fact sheet can be used kind of more for the general public, or not so much for establishments, because for the most part they're going to be closed. There are a few establishments in North Carolina that have gotten pre-approval for emergency operations plans. That's allowed in the Chapter 8 of the Food Code. And so we do have some grocery stores and Waffle House and Chick-fil-A that have gotten those approvals, but for the most part, facilities would just have their permits suspended. But this fact sheet can be used kind of for personal use that has some recommendations about how to handle the water, and then again the recovery and reopening part of this is included as well. So just in conclusion, for a takeaway message, I said it early on, that emotions are going to be very high, and there's going to be a lot of tension in these situations. You personally may be tired and stressed. We know that the business owners or people that you're dealing with are going to be tired and stressed, and so it's important to take each situation as it comes, because they're not going to be one and the same, and to make sure that you're prepared to communicate in that situation, that you can be flexible with your job duties, and understand that, in an emergency, everybody's kind of in the same place, and the way we communicate and our body language and our tone of voice is going to be very important. Your safety is also very important, so make sure you're not going into a situation where you feel unsafe. And very often incident command is going to be implemented in these situations, so make sure that you pay attention or paid attention in those FEMA courses, because I promise they'll come back to you and then you'll wish you would paid better attention. So I'm going to leave my contact information here for just a second. I'm always available if you have, after hours emergencies, or you need something during a normal work day. Feel free to reach out to me by phone or email. And not that I want to work with any of you in an emergency, but I look forward to working with you in your career. Thanks, everybody.